Two. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Today, we're going to be talking about how we make meaning from stories. My name is Sarah Florence Davidson. My Haida name is Anja Kusandlants, which means Killer Whale Woman of the Dawn. I am of settler and Haida ancestry and happy to be joined today or every day with Nikki. Over to you.
Hi, friends. My name is Nikki, and I am a colonizer of Mennonite and Chinese ancestry. And it's just such a pleasure and honor to be joining you from the traditional, unceded, and contemporary territories of the Coquitlam people. And I'm always happy to be here and engaging in conversations with you, Dr. Davidson.
And I am joining you today from the unceded territories of the Katzie, the Kwantlen, and the Semiahmoo peoples. And just a quick shout out to Raquel Martin, PhD, on Instagram, who really inspired us to bring our scholarship to a wider audience and start creating these little short videos. So I think just to dive right into thinking about making meaning and how we support other people to make meaning, I'm going to pass to Nikki.
Yeah, sure. So the first thing that we wanted to kind of think about was understanding the role of the listener and what do we need to do as the listener? What are our responsibilities? And I think that in Joanne Archibald's book, Kwam Kwam Hiam, she talks about her story work principles, and the first four are about getting story ready. And in particular, she's talking about respect, reciprocity, reverence, and responsibility. And Sarah, feel free to jump in here because I'm no expert. But for me, how I interpret that is how I'm understanding and thinking about story and the storyteller, right? So really having that sense of respect, reciprocity, like how can I give back? What can I do? How can I even like take up sort of the message of the story in a way that's going to like honor sort of the intention of the story, to treat the story with reverence and to sort of enact my responsibility. Just thinking about, how Thomas King talked about, now you've heard this story and you become different, right? So I don't know if you have another sort of take on that, Sarah.
Absolutely. And I think I appreciate your points about how important it is to think of ourselves as a listener and having responsibilities as a listener. I think we often think about that it's just this passive act, that we don't have any responsibilities. And I think that's one of the founding ideas connected to making meaning, is that making meaning is about the responsibility of the listener to engage with the story and to make that meaning. And I think um, when I'm working with students and even when I'm doing presentations and reading books to students, I am thinking about how can I support them as listeners? How can I support them to connect with these different story, these principles to help them to become story ready, and both by modeling them, but also how can I invite them into taking on these responsibilities as listeners to engage more deeply. And I was just doing a presentation and I had someone ask me, and I've never had this question about, is it possible to kind of make an incorrect meaning or make meaning incorrectly? And I thought it was a really great question. And we were chatting about this before we pressed record, and just this idea that I actually don't think that it's possible to make an incorrect meaning. I think that there are opportunities to go deeper with the story. And so if I feel like if we've got these sort of more surface meanings that folks are coming to as a result of engaging with the story, it may be that I haven't done enough work to set the foundation to really engage in that. And another way, when I was talking with them as well, was just thinking about how can we invite folks into this approach to engaging and learning from stories, and that it may be new for a lot of people. We've been brought up I know for myself, I was brought up that it's all about comprehension and understanding a singular message, and there is this one intended message by the author, and it's up to us to figure it out. And it doesn't recognize all of the experiences and knowledge that we're bringing to a particular story at a particular time. And so this idea of making meaning, to me, begins with this idea of personal connection, which we see in the BC curriculum. And so when I'm thinking about, that personal connection, I'm thinking about, what is it in my life that kind of has me think or understand this story in a particular way, and what are those connections that I'm making? And those are connected to my identity, they're connected to my lived experiences, and they're connected to how I'm thinking about particular ideas that are being shared in the story. And I mentioned last time we were talking about holistic engagement with story, which is the idea of connecting with a story mentally, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. And what I didn't mention last time, because I knew we would be talking about making meaning, is that a big part of that is sharing what it is that we're understanding from a story at a particular time. And so part of that holistic engagement when I'm doing it is to have students, or the listeners, if you will, they work with the story a little bit, and then they share out some of what they understood from the story as a result of engaging with it. And in that listening, we hear the way that that other folks are making meaning from that particular story. And so that is another important part of it. Is Nikki and I might listen to a story, you and I might listen to a story, and have different ideas. And as a result of me hearing what you think, I might then want to go back and listen to the story again, and see what comes to me as a result of having that connection with your understanding and the meaning that you made.
And so that recursive piece becomes really important, right? Like coming back to it and hearing from other people. And then it's like, okay, now I might hear it differently. But even, when we're at different stages or phases of our lives, not even that. It could be like today I'm going through something, tomorrow, something else happens. And the story is just speaking to me in lots of different ways. So, for example, this story, I've read this story many times. And I've read it like to my classes. And when it comes to the story, sometimes the story, and I mean, this story is so beautiful, right? And so something might speak to me in a very visceral way, and just feeling like I'm coming upon this teaching that I need at this point in my life. And so I kind of like what you said in terms of like, can we make sort of the wrong meaning? Like today I make this meaning and tomorrow I make that meaning. And like, how can that be wrong if that's sort of the teaching that I need at that moment in my life? But also, thinking about those, getting story ready, those Indigenous story work principles, that maybe if I'm engaging in those things, that helps me to go deeper into the story, and it helps open myself up in a deeper way to what the story can teach me, right? And so it's not then about being wrong, it's about sort of that process and where that process can and cannot take us, depending on the way that we're engaging in the meaning making process,
Yeah,
I
and
think.
I absolutely, I think what I appreciate is not that our new challenge is to bring in jigging for halibut with Shinny to every conversation. But what I appreciate about that is it is a contemporary example, and often when we think about this meaning making, or we think about working with Kwamkwampiam's um, Indigenous story work principles, we think that we're only talking about these traditional stories, and so it's in my mind it's an approach to engaging and learning from stories, all kinds of stories. And so one of the ones that I have often worked with is Lady Louse, and there's a beautiful telling by Kwam Kwam Piam that we'll share the recording after in the bottom here. But I've worked with that story. I've heard that story so many times, and as you say, each time I come to it, maybe I'm listening to other people talking about what the meaning they're making from the story, but I hear so many, and I think of so many different ideas, and just it's such a short story, and yet I find that wherever I am, whatever moment I'm in, what the things that I'm grappling with, I focus on a different part of it, and accept guidance from a different part of the story as a result of what I'm bringing to it in any particular moment. And so I do try and replicate that idea of recursive engagement with story in my classroom. And it's I think we have the First People's Principle of Learning in our BC curriculum, which is learning takes patience and time. And so I have I was, when I was teaching first year in education, introduction to education, we were talking a little bit about, um, how do we think about these principles and how do we learning takes patience and time in a really short period of time. And so I grappled with that a little bit. I had 13 classes with the students, and I started doing, I apologies to folks but I started with On the Trapline. So I read that on the first day. We were talking about Indigenous pedagogies. And then for the course of during the course, we worked with David A. Robinson's memoir, which is called Blackwater. And it's a longer version, and all of the parts of his life that relate a lot to the story. And then we also will sometimes do the podcast Kiwu, which is another sort of the oral telling of some of the stories that are connected to On the Trapline. And then we come back to On the Trapline on the very last day of class. And it's fascinating to hear the different understandings of the story, the different meanings that folks are making that they didn't make initially. And so we're able to kind of create an opportunity to come back to a story, and they can at least understand a little bit about why we might want to come back in that way to stories.
Mm. And you can kind of use this approach, I think, with lots of different stories, right? And it also helps us, I think, when we have this sort of a framework to think about what stories we want to bring into the classroom, right? So thinking about which stories can really prompt that depth of thought, that engagement, that interpretation, those connections, the creativity, and for us to be open to, those teachings that they have. So I have a couple of examples, and they're listed down in the notes there, but there's this one, We Are Grateful, which is just such a beautiful story. And for me, what it prompted was, it kind of describes things that we are grateful for through the lens of the Cherokee culture. And there's just some, and that made me think to my cultural background and what I could be grateful for, from that perspective. And so I'm not then appropriating and saying like, oh, somehow taking on the values of the Cherokee, but it's prompting that kind of reflection and interpretation of my own cultural values and thinking about what I might be grateful from my own perspective. And similarly, I am connected. Same kind of thing that this is coming from a Haida perspective and thinking about different ways that a Haida person might be connected from that cultural perspective. But again, I can look at those as sort of an example and then be open to the lesson that I am also connected within my community, my culture, my family. And what does that mean for me and my environment, right? And so what does that mean for me? So it's more about taking the meaning from the story and then interpreting that through my own cultural lens so that I'm not appropriating sort of the lens that's being presented in the books.
Yeah, and I think I can imagine that people might be reluctant to take this up in their classrooms because, we have the commitments to curriculum, we have, assessment requirements and things. And so I'm wondering if you can offer any thoughts on assessment before we wrap up today, just because I know that might be a potential barrier to engaging in this kind of work in classrooms.
Yeah, and I think it's important that we need to come in with a lens that we can really assess diverse responses by using maybe a rubric that looks at, the depth of engagement, the way students are interpreting ideas, how they're expressing their ideas in terms of organization or even grammar, if that's a priority for you. So thinking about different ways that we can assess that, those deeper sort of thinking skills. But it's not that they have to be engaging with the same resource, right? And it's not that they have to be engaging or taking the same lesson away, but it's the fact that they have thought deeply about it and that they've kind of, created those connections with their stories, whatever they may be. And that's really what we're looking for, right? So it's not even necessarily that I have to, I mean, of course, I'm going to go read in their stories because I love the literature, but it's not even about that. It's about how are they connecting? How are they making meaning? How is this important and relevant to them? And so there are ways that we can create those assessments that allow students to learn in an authentic way, right? Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We'll see you next time.
Thanks for the conversation, Sarah.
Always a pleasure.